Welcome to our lecture today on Hindu fundamentalism and the Babri Masjid, specifically the destruction of the Babri Masjid in the early 90s. This video is to be watched in conjunction with the documentary Ram Ke Naam, which means in the name of Ram, or could be translated to in the name of God. So this will give you context for that video, and the video will give you context for the lecture. It all goes together by design. So what is nationalism? So nationalism is valuing one's own nation or one's own religious group over all other nations or religious groups. Now, this is usually used as sort of like a qualifier, such as you have Black nationalism, white nationalism, Scottish nationalism, or Hindu nationalism. So often it's pretty negative. So when we talk about white nationalism in the United States, white nationalism argues that the USA is only for white people, and we should either expel or just ignore other people who are not white, who are people of color, who are migrants, who are non-white folk. Then you have purely political groups like Scottish nationalism, in which in Scottish nationalism it supports an independent Scottish nation that would be free from oversight and from connection to British rule. Everybody wants to get away from the British. It seems to make sense. Then you have a reaction against oppression can bring up nationalism, such as Black nationalism in the United States that supports unity and self-determination for Black folk, Black people, especially in the form of creating an independent Black nation. With Hindu nationalism, on the other hand, we are talking about nationalism and an idea that India is just for Hindus. So usually with nationalism, it has a vibe towards populist thinking. Now, that doesn't mean popular thinking. Populist means sort of an appeal to ordinary folks and appealing to them, feeling that their concerns are ignored or disregarded by elites and politicians. Now, we have another term in India that's important for you to get is communalism. Now, this doesn't mean community or communal, for instance. Communalism means groups who value their own community, i.e. their own religious group, over the concerns of all other people and all other religious groups. From this, we get the term communal violence. So communal violence says that you are a Hindu above all other things. And I found this lovely image. This is clearly from the Himalayas, where they note that Indian can be spelled out by all these different words. This would be the opposite of communalism. Communalism is not about bringing people together. It's about separating people apart. Once you separate them apart, bringing those littler groups, smaller groups together into a coherent identity that can be mobilized for political ends. Indian nationalism. What do I mean by Indian nationalism? And I have the pictures of two great Indian nationalists here. One would be Swami Vivekananda, who I've mentioned a little bit before, who believed that India needed to be free of the British, and it needed to have self-rule. And these are the key notions of Indian nationalism: is get rid of the British and have self-rule. But he argued that all Indians were unified by Indian culture, and they should all be working together towards a positive version of India. And then Gandhi as well, both of these guys were Hindus, was very much an Indian nationalist who wanted a secular India. By secular, I do not mean not religious, but I mean not officially religious. So Gandhi had almost a pluralistic style of thinking, in the sense that he wanted all religions to be comfortable and unified by a cohesive Indian identity. That didn't really work out, and it led to the partition, in which Pakistan was split off from India. And Gandhi, to some degree, was the one that finally said, all right, we just got to split it off, because I don't think we can find a solid agreement here. All right, so when I say Indian nationalism, I mean a free India, free from colonial rule, establishing self-rule or Swaraj, and dedicated to the welfare of all Indians, destruction of poverty, modern views on religions, and a great level of tolerance. I had said that Indian nationalism is secular, not in the sense that it's not religious, but that it's based on sort of religious pluralism, that all religions are vaguely, all religions are acceptable. This can be mapped onto a main political party in India that is not in control anymore, the Indian National Congress, who was the dominant political party from 1949 onward. and were definitely the framers of the Indian Constitution after they got rid of the British. So the Indian National Congress was sort of a religiously plural and secular political party, and they pursued an agenda of secularism and caste reform, as well as sort of social uplift and working with sort of minority groups. Lately, they have lost their power in India due to sort of populist backlash over that very platform. You can kind of map it onto like the notion of affirmative action in the United States. So Indian National Congress, affirmative action. Hindu nationalism, Hindu populism, non-affirmative action, to make a simple analog. So what is Hindu nationalism? And on the top, you see the current Prime Minister of India. This is Modi, and he's with Aditya Yogi, who is a very prominent Hindu fundamentalist and in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And he's also a member of a monastic group called the Nath Sampradaya. Okay, so Hindu nationalism argues that India is for Hindus. And they also argue that any Indian-originated religion will be considered Hindu. So they will incorporate into Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, and Buddhism. Now, Jains, Sikhs, and Buddhists would not say that they are Hindus, but the Hindus will claim them. What they are really interested in is no Muslims. So intriguingly, this is sort of rooted in a British methodology for ruling over India. They had a divide and rule kind of methodology. They would set up national censuses where people would have to declare themselves to be either a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Jain, which is kind of odd because Indians before the time of the British wouldn't have been so quick to separate themselves out into distinct identities. And once they were forced by the census to declare themselves Muslims or Hindus, suddenly they were like, well, now I don't trust, if I'm a Muslim, I don't trust the Hindus. If I'm a Hindu, I don't trust the Muslims. Whereas prior, they'd just be like, there's that guy down the block. I'm not over there. We all go to the same festivals. And that's a little bit of an overstatement. But so the British exploited religious differences in order for them to be more effective in ruling over India. And in fact, when Indians agitated for self-rule, the British would say, you can't rule yourself. You're so divided by religion. And the question is, did the British divide India by religion? They were definitely a big part of it. So in Hindu nationalism, the notion is, like I said, it is the nation is a Hindu nation. It's a nation for Hindus, and they advocate Hindutva. Hindutva means Hindu-ness. Now, Hindu-ness was a term coined by a guy named Savarkar, who was an early Indian freedom fighter and Hindu and rabid anti-Muslim character. He also did not care for Gandhi very much. There was an article that came out in The Economist a little while back that was described, that was about Savarkar, and he was described as the man who called Gandhi a sissy. So it is argued, in fact, by Hindu nationalists that Muslims are foreigners in India. Well, the argument is actually made that the Hindus own India and the Muslims are just tenants. Now, Muslims have been in India since, well, for more than 1,000 years. Hindu nationalists will argue that India should not have been split up. Pakistan should still be a part of India. And the Muslims should not have been given that, the right to have their own country. They would argue that Muslims are a minority, and as a minority, they shouldn't have any special privileges. That might sound familiar to you. There's quite a lot of overlap there with affirmative action in the United States. The propaganda of Hindu nationalists argues that Muslims are prodigious breeders. And in fact, they are going to have so many children, they will overwhelm the Hindus in India, which is not true. Hindus and Muslims have about as many children, and the Muslims hang around at right around 10% of the 10 to 15% of the population, just like they kind of always have. So they argue that the Hindu nationalists will argue that since they're minority and they've spent all this time kowtowing to them and accommodating to them, that Hindus just need to stop it. They would argue that neither government that is Muslim nor a government that is secular could ever properly give rights to Hindus, which is intriguing because when Pakistan split off from India, Jinnah, the father of Pakistan, really said, he's like, I can't believe that having a secular government wouldn't turn into a Hindu government. I can't believe that having Hindus in a position of power over Muslims would ever allow Muslims to be treated well. And there's some kind of argument for that. So Hindu fundamentalists, and this is my last point here, they have an idea that there was an ideal Hindu civilization before the Muslims came. And the symbol of that civilization would be the god Rama, or Ram. Now, Rama is the hero of the Ramayana, which is a story about a great king who's displaced from his kingdom, and he has to live in the wilderness, and then his wife gets kidnapped by a demon who lives in Sri Lanka, and so he has to go and take over Sri Lanka and kill that demon, and then come on back with his wife, and then he regains rule over his sort of whole world. Now, that's the story of the Ramayana. In Hindu fundamentalism, and Hindu nationalism, they want to have the rule be Hindu, and they model it on Ram. They'll even call it Ram Raj. They'll say, we want Ram Raj, the kingdom of Ram, the rule of Ram. And in fact, they will even depict themselves as monkeys. Where am I going with that? Well, Ram's great devotee was a guy named Hanuman, who was the king of the monkeys. And in the Ramayana, Hanuman's monkey army aids Rama in conquering Sri Lanka and killing the demon Ravana. So you'll hear Indian nationalists or Hindu nationalists and Hindu fundamentalists say, we are like Rama's monkey army, so his devoted followers. So we're talking here really about fundamentalism. And I'm going to talk about three sort of political religious groups in India. But first I want to define fundamentalism. So these organizations start in the 19th to the 20th century. But let's go back to Kripal. What does Kripal say about fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is a modern way of being religious that relies on highly selective literalist readings of an inerrant or an unerring, a perfect scripture, and on a return to fundamentals, the postulated original truths of faith. They want to go back to the original fundamentals of the faith, the earliest versions of the faith. Of course, as they do that, they're positing a new version of the faith. I've said a couple of times in class that I had an old anthropologist professor who would always call fundamentalism the circling of the wagons. You take your whole community and you circle them around to shut everyone else out. And everything outside of that circle of the wagons is perceived as a threat. So fundamentalism is drawing together your community, unifying by religious fundamentals that you say are really old, but are probably pretty new, and arguing that anything outside of that is dangerous and must either be defended from or attacked outward. So in our three fundamentalist organizations, Hindu fundamentalist organizations, we're going to talk about the RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangha, and I'll define that for you. The VHP, which is the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. And then finally, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the contemporary party in power in India. So what is the RSS? The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangha can be translated loosely to a national volunteer organization. Now, this is a right-wing group. They're very nationalist, but they're also very Hindu, and they're into Hindutva. This is one of the oldest groups. They got started at the end of the 19th century and were very organized against the British, but also to be pro-Hindu. Originally, they were actually banned and under the British for advocating for self-rule, so they were revolutionary at the time. However, they're kind of complicated. In fact, when Gandhi was assassinated, it was a member of the RSS who killed him. Gandhi was not killed by Muslims. He was killed by another Hindu, by a Hindu fundamentalist who didn't like him giving Pakistan to the Muslims. And incidentally, back to our god Ram, the last words that Gandhi said upon being shot was, "Hey Ram, oh God Ram." The question is, what would Gandhi think about all of the things that we're going to talk today? I don't think he'd be very terribly happy. All right, so the RSS is aimed to unite Hindus, and they wanted to organize them into sort of informal local groups that would study, exercise, and train for combat. You can see them that they wear khaki pants, white shirts, black hats, and they carry those sticks that are called lathis. They also do quite a bit of yoga. And if you're hanging out in India and you look out in the morning and you see a whole bunch of dudes in khaki and black hats with lathis doing exercises, that's usually your local RSS group. Over time, they were thought to bring a sort of manliness to Hinduism. Now, why do I bring that up? It's thought that the British took away the masculinity of Hindus by ruling for the 400 or 500 years that they ruled. And then it's thought that the British also further took away and emasculated Hindu men. And a lot of these groups argue for manning up Hinduism once again to its original glories. Over time, they became quite anti-Muslim and opposed all efforts to accommodate Muslims in independence after the British left. Also, quite a few renunciates are a part of this order, so swamis and sadhus, and they tend to be well populating the leadership of the RSS. The VHP, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which can be translated something like Worldwide Hindu Organization. So this is actually designated as a violent hate group, as a violent religious group by the CIA. They are they argue once again that all Indian religions are Hindu religions, but not Islam. They organized around implementing the ideas of the RSS. So the VHP develops out of the RSS. And they had sort of volunteer services that include medical services, education, and social welfare. They have a large youth outreach component. We're going to see with the destruction of Babri Masjid in just a second that it was the VHP was the main ideological organization that supported Hindu fundamentalists unifying, rallying, and tearing down a mosque. They are found in the United States. They're found worldwide. In fact, I'll talk about that toward the end of this lecture. One of their main activities is to reconvert Hindus. So they'll find people that have converted to Protestant Christianity for social uplift or another sort of Western religion and try to convert them back to become originally Hindus. Now, were they Hindus originally? It's hard to say. They are hard to separate out from the RSS, and lots of their members overlap. Now, like I said, they really cooked up and spread this idea that the Babri Masjid, this mosque that we're going to talk about, was actually an ancient temple that the site was actually an ancient temple dedicated to glorifying the birthplace of the god Ram. Finally, we have the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which means like the party of Indian people. So this is the political arm of Hindu fundamentalism. They're definitely like the elected officials that use the ideology of BHP and the RSS. Since the 1990s, they've gained more and more local and national power in India. And like I said, the Indian National Congress was sort of a secular, pluralistic group that was very powerful in India after independence, and the BJP has now pretty much owned them in the last couple cycles of elections. They are anti-Muslim, explicitly or implicitly, so they will, and I have a picture here of Modi, the prime minister right now, hugging a kind of famous Hindu fundamentalist yogi. They have this symbol of a lotus, once again. They're popular. They're big. Yeah, BJP's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger in India. They're either explicitly anti-Muslim or they're implicitly anti-Muslim. So they'll just kind of like ignore violence against Muslims or find a way not to inspire more violence, but to not quell violence. They provided the political muscle to implement the VHP vision on the Ram Janmabhoomi, the temple dedicated to the birthplace of Ram, and for tearing down the Babri Masjid. Along with the VHP, along with the BJP, the BJP has a number of political figures who are instrumental, and that we'll see in the video, in bringing about the destruction of the Babri Masjid. One guy, Mr. L.K. Advani, right here, who also you can see, what he did was he had what he called a Rath Yatra, which means a chariot journey, in which he built this chariot that will look like the future temple of Rama. And he put it on a truck and he traveled all over India. In fact, one of the people helping him out on this trip was a very young Prime Minister Modi. You can see him in a picture down there. So anyway, what Advani would do is he would go to different places throughout northern India and he would get people really excited and talk about how the Muslims have been ruining India and how they took over this temple site where God was born and they need to tear it down. And then along the way, he would pick up lots of volunteers that he called kar sevaks, which means sort of folk doing service. And these kar sevaks were steadily gathered and mobilized, and they eventually did tear down the Babri Masjid. Eventually, Advani was actually found to be responsible for inciting violence, and he was briefly imprisoned for that. These days, he's still around. I mean, and he's a main advisor to Modi, who's in power now, like I said. So what was the goal of Advani's Rath Yatra that we saw in the video? Well, and the goal of destroying the Babri Masjid. It was to restore respect to the glorious and unified Hindu culture, one that never really existed. And they used the Babri Masjid and this new temple to the birthplace of Ram as an example of their vision. And in fact, even to this day, people yell and shout and scream about this to mobilize folk. It's almost like what we call dog whistle politics in the United States. In fact, in the year 2009, 68 people were found responsible for the demolition of the mosque, and thereby inciting quite a bit of violence in India. And almost all of those 68 people were BJP leaders. So if you think that these three groups sort of overlap and they're hard to tell the difference, well, it's because they do overlap and they're hard to really sort out. So what's our event that we're talking about today? The Babri Masjid. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the timeline and the history of this. But here's a quick summary. What happens is the Babri Masjid, so masjid just means mosque. The Babri Masjid was a 16th century mosque in the town of Ayodhya. Now, in the Ramayana, the oldest version of the story of Ram, the god Ram was born in some town called Ayodhya, though likely not this town, in fact. Hindu fundamentalists in the 1990s tore down the mosque and vowed to build the Ram Janmabhoomi temple, the temple to the birthplace of the god Ram, and dedicate that place to, of course, Ram. They have not built it yet. It's been since the 1990s, but as we'll see, there have been developments in 2020 that suggest that the temple is now going to be built all these years later. So what's the history here? Well, the Indian Archaeological Survey group found that there was a 10th century shrine under the mosque, but the shrine is most likely to be a Jain shrine, or maybe even a Shaiva. It's also dedicated to the god Shiva, but definitely not any sort of religious monument or temple to the god Rama. So Ayodhya, in fact, was a long-standing Jain site. And in fact, when we listen to what foreign travelers have said, like the Chinese Buddhist travelers, we see that their descriptions, like when in like 700 and 800, when they're writing in Chinese, they describe it as being primarily a Buddhist or a Jain place, not a predominantly Hindu place. Definitely not a place completely dedicated to the god Ram. This original mosque of the Babri Masjid was built in 1528, and from our inscriptions and whatnot, it probably wasn't a terribly popular place. It wasn't in a lot of use. So Ayodhya has been a temple town for a long time. Like I said, it was probably originally a Buddhist or Jain place. The town of Ayodhya in the Ramayana cannot clearly be identified, but we can almost definitely say that it would not have been where the modern town of Ayodhya is. So the association of this area and this place with Rama only starts in the 1300s. And in fact, we only see in about 1574, there's a text called the Ramcaritmanas, which is a Hindi version of the Ramayana. It's when that comes out and people start, and that's the text that most people study. They don't study the Sanskrit. They listen to the Hindi text. It was written by a saint named Tulsidas. So that is the text that people use to establish, the glory of Rama and to talk about Rama being born in contemporary Ayodhya. But even there, that's like 100 years. That text was written 100 years after the mosque was built. So yes, there's a long tradition of peaceful coexistence in the temple town of Ayodhya, though not terribly much lately. So in fact, it was likely the British. Oh, I need to mention this. So we're talking about Rama. These two pictures are really good kind of understandings of Rama. So up into the 1970s, the most common picture that you'd see all over India of Rama was this guy hugging his monkey friend, his perfect devotee. And that's a symbol of Ram and his love and Hanuman's love for him. This was the most popular picture. These days, when you see pictures of Rama, you can see he looks like a bodybuilder. And he's got his bow out, and he's ready to mess some stuff up. He's ready to cause a ruckus. So this is one thing that we've seen in the rise of Hindu fundamentalism and Hindu nationalism, is the gods have become more muscular, more masculine, more dominant, which I find that to be a really curious shift and a very telling shift in Hindu culture. So the British actually could be blamed. I always like to blame the British It was likely the British and their associates, the Jesuit priests, who argued that there was originally a Hindu temple at the at the Babri Masjid. So they kind of saw that there was problems, and what they did is they built a big wall in the Babri Masjid, and they had a Hindu temple on one side, basically an active Hindu community, and then an active Muslim community there as well. So people before 1949, and I'll get to that in a minute, they were hanging out fine. There were two active co-religionists there. They were just fine having the Muslims there and the Hindus there. And arguably, the Hindu community was still open to the Muslims coming back to the Babri Masjid. So again, we're tearing down a mosque where there is an active Hindu temple in it to build another Hindu temple. So there are problems there. So again, the British really like to divide and rule. So often when they would find situations like this, they would aggravate them because they realized if Indians were too busy fighting over who's a Muslim and who's a Hindu, if they can hang along, they won't have time to try to agitate for independence from the British. So in 1949, a man who's a priest had a dream or a vision of a young Rama who was playing in the temple. Soon after that, some idols appear as if by a miracle. A priest later admitted saying, yeah, I put those images there. He went to jail for a little while, got bailed out pretty quick, never faced any real consequences. But that's when things really start to get ugly, is in 1949. And as you'll see in the video, the Muslim community there was told, go pray somewhere else, and by next Friday, you'll be back in business at the Babri Masjid. And they were never restored. The Muslims never gained access again to the Babri Masjid after 1949. So in post-independence India, tensions were high. And in fact, what they did is they would, as the government saw that there were so many problems, that they would get a pujari priest. Pujari just means priest, one who leads worship. The government would court appoint a priest. And in fact, at the time of the Babri Masjid being attacked and torn down, it was this character here, whose name is Pujari Lal Das. And he's a very educated man who was actually supposed to be a very skilled priest, also a communist. And he had his community was very well established. And he kept saying, don't tear down my temple. I know it's a temple and a mosque. You guys are not doing anything for Ayodhya. And he, in fact, in our video, Ram Ke Naam, explicitly says, I've never seen any of these politicians come and worship here if their Ramayana and their Hinduism is such a big deal. Well, how come they're never here? He was murdered a few years after the Babri Masjid was torn down. All right, so before everything really kicked off in 1990, a group of prominent historians, you read about this for today, looked at all the archaeology, presented all the information based on history, archaeology, and textual study of the texts that supposedly prove that Rama was born in modern Ayodhya, and they say, no, kind of hogwash, in fact. So what they argued is, it is appropriate, therefore, that a political solution is urgently found. So the Ram Janmabhoomi / Babri Masjid, the two kind of communities going on there, area, ought to be demarcated and declared a national monument. That would have been a great idea. They didn't do that, and things went south. In 1990, these Kar Sevaks in 1990, it's the first thing that happened, is after Advani's sort of traveling around inciting people, his people came and they advanced on the temple and on the mosque, and eventually the mostly Hindu police let them begin to smash up the walls. 6 Hindus were killed. Now, a year later, in 1992, after the BJP had a large victory, the VHP-inspired Hindus, so BJP and VHP, stormed the mosque and tore it down completely. And it's been there, inactive, with people sending money and people sending bricks that are all over the place, but it's been inactive until 2020, which we'll talk about in a second. So what do I mean by communal violence and the communal violence that has come out of this Babri Masjid? Well, right after the masjid was torn down, there were riots and nearly 2,000 people were killed. And about 6 weeks later in Bombay, as a reaction to the riots, again, 900 people were killed. The majority of people killed were Muslims. That is the case almost always in India. In 2002, there were riots in Gujarat, and at the time, Prime Minister Modi, contemporary Prime Minister Modi, was sort of the overseer, like governor of Gujarat. In fact, what happened is there was a fire on a train, and it was likely an accident. But it was said that Muslims started this fire in order to burn alive Hindus on the train. Likely that did not happen. In the aftermath of that, in 2002, 2,000 people were killed and 150,000 people were displaced, mostly Muslims, once again. The government of Gujarat at that time was headed by Modi, and he looked the other way. He might have even been complicit in encouraging the violence. It's unclear, but he didn't do much to try to stop it. Recently, in 2020, we had the anti-Muslim Delhi riots, in the town of New Delhi, there were these so-called Delhi riots, in which Hindu mobs attacked and killed Muslims. In fact, they killed 53 people were killed, 2/3 of them were Muslims. This is overlapped at the same time by a visit from then President Donald Trump, who was in town, and somehow they managed to avert it so that he wouldn't see any of the violence. And in all of his public addresses, both he and Modi just pretended there was nothing going on and didn't speak to it in any way. So what was going on here? In fact, it was caused by a protest over a BJP government attempt to remove the citizenship of Muslims and to fast track anybody who wanted to be any immigrant or refugee who wanted to come into India who was Hindu or Sikh or whatever, but to really restrict Muslim refugees coming in. If you know what was going on with the Rohingya in Burma, then you can kind of see what's going on there. Okay, so we had these terms, exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, which are good technical terms, but they're hard to apply here. Our terms don't perfectly map onto these Indian situations. Hindu fundamentalists are definitely exclusivists when it comes to Muslims, but they are inclusive of other Indian origin religions. Oddly, they're also inclusive towards Zoroastrianism, which comes from Persia originally. The Indian government has been, for the most part, secular and pluralist, and the Constitution declares it is a secular nation that that is not affiliated with any one religion, despite the fact that we have predominantly in power right now Hindu fundamentalists. Hindus in general, I find, are pretty inclusive of most religions. And not all Hindus are Hindu fundamentalists by any means. You could really wander around India and often hear, and often hear people, saying, Hindus and Muslims are brothers, like Hindu Musliman, bye-bye. We are all brothers, and you do have quite a few Hindus and quite a few Muslims who do want to be together and do want it to be a nation that they work for as Indians and not as Hindus or Muslims. However, what we see is that politics and religion cannot be separated, as I'm going to look at here in a second. This is one thing I really want you to have as a takeaway here. Don't trust politicians who appeal towards religions. And don't trust religious people who say they aren't political. The political and the religious are always connected and cannot be separated apart. So where are we now? As of the summer, in fact, in August of 2020, the Prime Minister of India, Modi, has endorsed and supported Hindus inaugurating the building of the Ram Janmabhoomi temple in Ayodhya. So this land has not been developed, and it's just been a pile of rubble for 30 years. Well, they're in power now, so they're going to do it. They're going to build it. So the American VHP, because Hindu fundamentalism is active in the United States, the day before Modi inaugurated the building of the temple, actually advertised for the temple and for the temple being built in Times Square, in a very prominent area. Throughout the time since the Babri Masjid was broken up, we would see that people would donate bricks. So you can go around the area where the temple will be built and you find just giant piles of bricks. If you look at these bricks, and if you read Devanagari, they say like Sri Ram or Hey Ram. They all have the name Rama on them. So people would dedicate these bricks to the building of the temple, and there's tremendous corruption. From the get-go, a lot of people have written about how a lot of the donations to the religious organizations that sponsored building this temple are corrupt, and the funds have been sort of distributed all over the place. Those Hey Ram, Sri Ram bricks tend to end up in people's houses or to build other temples all over Ayodhya. So there's quite a bit of corruption here. And we'll see that in the video as well. Even at a certain point, the national banks of India refused to process international donations to the VHP because the VHP was linked to violence. And it was an organization that was officially declared by the Indian government as causing violence. They seem to be doing all right now. So, yes, the people of Ayodhya, if you talk with them, they generally still feel betrayed. And like all of these national organizations, these Hindus from all over the place who were not local, came there, tore down their temple, or tore down their mosque, didn't build another temple, and have used the town of Ayodhya and this mosque and this future temple as sort of a political football to pass back and forth. In this case, you really see that the ideas and ideals and desires of the locals of Ayodhya were ignored by the translocal and larger governmental groups. The building of the temple to Ram, in fact, and the destruction of the masjid are continuing touchstones for populist appeal by politicians. It's a dog whistle. So if a Hindu fundamentalist starts talking about the Babri Masjid, people get all excited. You know that he really doesn't care about that mosque or that temple all that much. What he cares about is getting people really excited, and that will help him push his agenda forward. The narrative remains that Muslims destroyed the glorious Hindu culture and unmanned the Hindus. I hear Hindus say this all the time in India. There's anger at the British for dividing India, but the real rage is cast upon the Muslims. And it's tough to be a Muslim in India. You're a minority. If there is violence, your people are going to get killed a lot worse. It's hard to advance in the world. You're not in the Hindu system. You're outside of it. And if you have a historical tradition of tolerance in your local world, which many Muslims have, they're watching it be eroded by the national conversation that is anti-Muslim and pro-Hindu fundamentalist. We'll remember that this divided notion was in the service of the British. And when the British would argue that Indians couldn't have self-rule, they'd say, you're so divided by religion, there's no way you could possibly rule yourselves. And they did pretty well, and Indians are doing pretty well, and Indians clearly can rule themselves. But that division that the British started really created this pro-Hindu, anti-Islam narrative that suffuses everything in Indian culture today. I mean, I would argue, and I really argue this, India is not India without Muslim culture. Muslim culture brings the nature of the food, the music. I mean, you wouldn't have like spices, and you wouldn't have any of the classic Indian dishes if you didn't have Muslim influence. The whole style of music, the sitar wasn't in India until Muslims brought it. A notion of wider rule across the whole Indian scape is arguably a British notion. If you speak Hindi, you'll notice that all of the words for sort of like for anything involved with like doing something in an office are Persianate. Why? Because Persians and Muslims brought sort of courtly culture of correspondence and letter writing and documentation. Now that's like, bureaucracy. The good Indian bureaucracy is very Muslim. The bad Indian bureaucracy is a turbocharged version of the British bureaucracy, which only the Indians could make British bureaucracy worse. The great majority of artists, not even the majority, I don't even say the majority of artists and musicians and actors are Muslims. If you look at the biggest names in Bollywood right now, the majority of them are Muslims, let alone the wide-ranging history of Urdu scholarship and literature. In fact, our language, Hindi, that is this wide-spoken language, originally was closer to Urdu, and it showed up in the areas around Benares, and it was only later that it was given all the Sanskrit terminology that it has to make it this sort of Hindu-sounding religion. But traditionally, the earliest versions of Hindi actually sound much more like Persian than, say, Sanskrit. So what I mean to say in the end is everything goes off the rails in a specific moment. Indian nationalism means India for Indians, make it all work. Hindu nationalism, India for Hindus, no Muslims. When your politics and religion get overwhelmed by hate and your self-identity becomes more important than the people around you, when you and yours are more important than your neighbors and theirs, that's when you're not being collective, you're being communal. And when that happens, nations are divided and violence happens. Because the only way you can do violence to another person is to see them as less than human. And Hindu nationalism argues that the other, the Muslims, are less than human. As such, they can be killed. So be careful with your nationalisms. Take care out there.